In 1839, a schooner set sail from Havana, Cuba. On board were the goods two Spaniards had just purchased, along with dozens of enslaved Africans. One night, a revolt broke out on the ship. The black captives killed the ship's owner and took control of the vessel, but because they did not know how to navigate, they kept the two Spaniards alive and pointed toward the sun, ordering them to sail the ship back to Africa. Of course, the two men had no intention of obeying. During the day, they sailed in the direction of the sun, but at night they pushed the ship hard in the opposite direction, trying to reach the United States for help. 6 weeks later, they actually sailed into the waters near Long Island, New York, where they were spotted by the U.S. Navy. The two Spaniards immediately asked the American forces for help, and more than 40 black people were arrested. This unremarkable schooner then drifted into American history. It was the Amistad. The U.S. Navy lieutenant who seized the Amistad did not send the people to the nearest court in New York, but instead detoured to Connecticut. At the time, there was an international salvage convention, under which rescuers could receive part of a ship's cargo. What the lieutenant wanted was exactly that: the goods on board, and the black captives. The problem was that in New York State, the slave trade was illegal, meaning black people could not be classified as cargo. To understand this, we need to look at the situation of enslaved black people in America at the time. In 1807, shortly after Britain, the United States passed a law abolishing the slave trade, but over whether slavery itself should continue or be abolished. The North and South had been locked in a long tug-of-war. The South developed a plantation economy, and enslaved black people were treated as major property there. The North, meanwhile, developed a capitalist industrial economy, and slavery could not release the labor force it needed. At that time, New York had already become a free state that abolished slavery, but Connecticut's abolition process was slower, meaning black people could be free in New York, yet still possibly treated as property in Connecticut. As soon as these black captives came ashore, they caught the attention of abolitionists. Among them were Tappan and Theodore. They published newspaper reports to draw public attention to the case, while also trying to fight for a writ of habeas corpus for the black captives. But this case was far more complicated than they had imagined, because no one could understand the language spoken by the black captives. Only the testimony of the Spanish cargo owners was available. According to that version, the Spaniards had bought these enslaved people in Cuba, and during the voyage, the black captives killed the ship's owner and hijacked the vessel. They also provided official passes issued in Cuba, listing the names of these enslaved people. Based on the Spaniards' testimony, the Connecticut prosecutor charged the black captives with piracy and murder, but neither the U.S. Navy nor the Spanish cargo owners were satisfied. The U.S. Navy demanded that, under the Salvage Convention, the black captives be awarded to them as a reward. The Spanish cargo owners hired a lawyer and demanded that the black captives be returned to their so-called owners. Even Spain's Queen Isabella II suddenly stepped into the matter. The Queen personally wrote a letter demanding that, under the Cinque Treaty signed by the United States and Spain in 1795, America returned the Amistad and its cargo, unchanged, to Cuba, then a Spanish colony, for handling. Spain did not want this case to become the beginning of a blow against its slave trade. The Queen's involvement raised the case to a diplomatic level. The American president at the time, Van Buren, also wanted to go along with Spain's demand and send the case away as quickly as possible, because for Van Buren, who wanted re-election, this case was a political hot potato. Van Buren could be considered a moderate abolitionist. He won votes from northern states because he leaned toward abolition, and because his position was moderate. He did not offend the southern states too much, but the appearance of this case no longer allowed him to keep sitting on the fence. The best solution, in his mind, was to get rid of the ship and all these black captives. After all, this was originally a case that happened outside American territory, involving people who were all foreigners, under international law at the time, and under the Cinque Treaty between the United States and Spain. Doing so seemed reasonable, but after abolitionists pushed the case into the media, it drew widespread public attention. If the ship were sent back to Cuba, these black captives would almost certainly die. Legally, the argument might make sense, but morally, the public could not accept it. The president had to take public opinion into account. On top of that, the case had already entered the judicial process, and as part of the executive branch, the president had no authority to interfere. At this point, a lawyer named Roger took the initiative to approach Tappan and the others. Roger volunteered to defend the black captives in court and proposed a new angle. Before this case could become a criminal case, their identity first had to be established. If the black captives were enslaved property, then they were cargo and had no standing to be tried. But if these black captives were free people who had been kidnapped, then killing in resistance while their freedom was being taken from them would not be a crime. The passes stated that these black captives were locally born Latino enslaved people from Cuba, but Roger suspected that this was very likely not true. In 1817, under pressure, Spain had signed an agreement with Britain banning the trafficking of enslaved people from Africa. From that point on, Cuba's slave market was forbidden from importing new captives, and could only trade people already enslaved locally. Yet illegal slave ships continued arriving in Cuba without end. Labeling them as locally born enslaved people became a way for the agencies issuing these passes to make money. Roger tried to communicate with the black captives, but he did not understand their language, and they did not understand English or Spanish. Since they did not even understand Spanish, Roger was basically certain that they were not the locally born enslaved people described on the passes, but free people who had been abducted from Africa. But the judge said that proving through demonstration that these black captives were not locally born enslaved people could not count as direct evidence. After all, no one could be certain whether they were pretending. To find evidence, Roger applied for a search warrant for the Amistad. Inside the cabin, they saw the place where the black captives had been confined. It was dark and deathly silent, filled with black chains. Roger found a cargo list on the ship. It clearly recorded the transport of black captives, but this cargo list did not belong to the Amistad. It belonged to the notorious Portuguese slave ship Tequera. The cargo list proved that these black captives had not been born enslaved on Cuban plantations, but were free people kidnapped from West Africa. With this evidence, they had basically secured the upper hand. But just then, the judge was replaced. It turned out that President Van Buren had been interfering behind the scenes. In a society where racial prejudice was still deeply rooted, many people found it hard to accept a verdict that would declare a group of black people innocent after they had killed white men, especially among Southern enslavers. Rumors began spreading everywhere. Some claimed that if this case ended with a victory for the black captives, the Southern states would refuse to support Van Buren's re-election, and might even further intensify the conflict between North and South, possibly triggering a civil war. Faced with this situation, Van Buren chose compromise. He had to secretly interfere in the judicial process, dissolve the jury, and replace the judge. The newly appointed judge, Coughlin, was known for his racial prejudice. Facing this sudden change, Theodore went to former President Quincy. Quincy's father was one of America's founding fathers, John Adams, the second President of the United States. In his youth, Quincy had built his career alongside his father, and had once been regarded by Washington as the most talented diplomat of his time. Later, he was elected the sixth President of the United States. After failing to win re-election, he was elected again as a member of the House of Representatives. Someone had once advised him not to accept the position, because for a former president to become a congressman seemed beneath his status. But Quincy said that no one loses dignity by serving the people. On slavery, Quincy had never made an explicit statement, but his past actions made Theodore believe that he supported abolition. This time, he still did not state his position directly, and only offered Theodore one piece of advice, based on his experience as a lawyer when he was young. In court, whoever tells the more compelling story often wins. Quincy saw things very clearly. What Theodore and the others were doing now was not merely defending a group of black captives against criminal charges. They were also, on the foundation of the law, pushing history forward. The final ruling would be based on the law, but it would also be influenced by the personal views of the jury and the judge. Inspired by this, Theodore immediately went back to discuss strategy with everyone. To know the story of the black captives, they first had to share a language. Roger had once brought in a linguistics professor, but unfortunately, even the professor could not understand what language the black captives were speaking. Still, the professor managed to figure out the pronunciations of several numbers. So Roger and Theodore went into the streets to look for someone who could understand them, and they really did find a black soldier who could. It turned out the language was Mend. With an interpreter, they finally learned what these black captives had been through. The leader of the revolt was named Cinque. He had been kidnapped by local people in his homeland and taken to a slave camp in Sierra Leone, then sold onto the Tequera. Hundreds of them, including women and children, were locked in the cramped hold of the ship. Many died from hunger or disease during the voyage. Because food rations were not enough, dozens of black captives were thrown directly into the sea. The Portuguese crew also tied up black captives and whipped them, forcing the others to watch. In despair, one mother held her child and jumped into the sea. After 2 months at sea, they arrived at the slave market in Havana, Cuba. Dozens of them, including Cinque, were bought by the two Spaniards and taken aboard the Amistad. At that time, they believed that only death was waiting for them. So one night, they found a way to break free of their chains and launched a revolt. Yet they did not make it back to their homeland as they had hoped, but drifted instead to this completely unfamiliar country. They did not understand what a courtroom was, and they could not understand what those white men were arguing about. But through their contact with Roger and the others, they instinctively felt that Roger was trying to help them. They felt these people were like the ones who had once helped them back in Africa. In court, Cinque told their story through an interpreter, but the prosecutor questioned whether Cinque's words were true. To verify Cinque's testimony, Roger brought in a British Royal Navy officer who specialized in fighting the maritime slave trade. The officer confirmed that the slave camp Cinque described did indeed exist. He also confirmed that slave ships did throw black captives into the sea under certain circumstances. The reduced number of people and weight recorded on the cargo list could also prove this point.
And what poundage do you imagine the entry may refer to, sir? A mast and sails, perhaps?
By now, everyone present had reached a judgment in their hearts. Naturally, Coughlin, sitting on the judge's bench, was no exception. At that moment, Cinque shouted in court the words he had just learned. "Give us free!" Coughlin's heart fell into struggle. Although he was racially prejudiced, he was mainly opposed to racial integration and racial mixing. Faced with such inhuman cruelty, as a devout Christian, he could not accept it. And as a judge, he had professional dignity. He could not turn a blind eye to the facts placed before him. On the day of the verdict, he made a decision the president never expected. In court, he acknowledged that these black captives were free people. He rejected the demands of Spain's Queen Isabella II and the U.S. Navy. He also ordered the two Spanish cargo owners arrested for trafficking enslaved people. All the black captives were released in court, and the government would pay to send them back to their African homeland. As the cheers of the black captives rang out, Roger and the others finally breathed a long sigh of relief. But now the president was in serious trouble. At a dinner hosting the Spanish envoy, Van Buren was bluntly confronted by the Southern Senator Calhoun. Calhoun made it clear that this verdict was encouraging the abolitionists and provoking the Southern states. If the North insisted on cutting off the South's source of wealth, then the matter might only be settled through war.
Because the real determination our courts and our president must make is not whether this ragtag group of Africans raise swords against their enemy, but rather, must we?
Van Buren did not want a civil war to break out during his term. That was not something an ordinary person in power could bear. Van Buren's heart was pounding with unease. This result was bad for his re-election. No one wanted a civil war to happen at this moment. To appease the southern states, the Van Buren administration appealed the case to the Supreme Court. This news hit Roger and the others the hardest. On one hand, they had to find a way to explain to the black captives why a case they had already won had to be tried again. On the other hand, 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices came from southern states. A Supreme Court ruling would be final. If they lost, the fate of these black captives would be grim. It would also be a major blow to the abolitionist cause. Along the way, because they defended the black captives, they had repeatedly suffered intimidation, threats, and physical attacks. But they never backed down, because they had ideals. Roger's grandfather had signed the Declaration of Independence. Tappan was a descendant of Benjamin Franklin. Theodore was a free black man who had escaped slavery. Their shared ideal was to practice the founding spirit of freedom and equality, abolish slavery, and push America into a new stage of civilization. Facing the bleak situation before them, they once again thought of former President Quincy. Quincy, now 73 years old, decided this time to step in, not only because he too was a descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but also because he had once steered this nation himself. He knew that even the wisest leader cannot escape the truth that people die and policies fade. Only systems can endure through the ages. He knew very clearly that abolition was the tide of history. Only by freeing enslaved people could the country develop its industrial structure. Only then could the economy take off, and human society move forward. In fact, he had been following this case from the very beginning. This time, he joined as the lead counsel for the defense. Before the hearing, he had a conversation with Cinque. Cinque said that in his homeland, whenever they reached a critical moment, they would ask their ancestors for help. Those words gave Quincy enormous encouragement. Was he not also completing the unfinished work of his own forebears? Completing the promise written in the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal. On the day of the hearing, Quincy got straight to the point. As a criminal case, This matter had already ended. The evidence at the first trial was clear and needed no further explanation. The reason we are here is politics, not law. Under secret pressure from the government, this case has been pushed to the Supreme Court. So much so that we have forgotten the independence of the sacred judicial system, and forgotten that our forefathers built today's Constitution on natural law. If the southern states are right, if slavery is right, then how are we supposed to face the words in the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal, and that human rights and freedom exist? May God grant us the courage to do what is right. If that means civil war, then let it come.
May it be finally the last battle of the American Revolution.
Quincy's words struck directly at the professional nerves of the justices. The sacred nature of America's judicial system depends on its independence. The judiciary is independent from the executive, and the law is independent from politics. They knew very well that this was the foundation of the nation, and it could not be shaken. In the end, they upheld the foundation on which the country was built and delivered their ruling. The black captives aboard the Amistad were free people, not cargo, and therefore the Pinckney Treaty did not apply to this case. As free people, when their personal freedom was taken from them, the black captives had the right to resist. Only one justice dissented from the ruling. Therefore, the court ordered the defendants released on the spot. At last, the Amistad case finally came to an end. Cinque and his fellow countrymen were sent back to their African homeland. Roger, Theodore, Tappan, and the others continued working for the abolitionist cause. That year, because of his moderate attitude towards slavery in the Amistad case, Van Buren lost the votes of 6 northern states that had once supported him, and ultimately failed to win re-election. Civil war did not break out immediately, but the Amistad case undoubtedly planted the seeds for the later war between North and South. In 1865, after 4 years of civil war, the Union in the North emerged victorious. Only then was slavery in the United States finally abolished in full. Never say ideals are useless. To change deep misunderstandings and prejudice is to change the world. Even today, there is still a long road ahead.